So, welcome everybody. Welcome to the British Institute at Ankara. I'm Leonidas Karakatsanis, I'm the Assistant Director of the Institute, and really happy to see such a great participation for the lecture today, and it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Ceyda Karamursel from SOAS, the Department of History, University of London, who received her PhD in History at the University of Pennsylvania, where she also held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Middle East Center. Ceyda's work explores the practice of slavery and elusive meanings of freedom in the late Ottoman Empire and early Turkish Republic, and her research has been supported by the Social Science Research Council and the Charles W. Newcomb Foundation, among others. She's currently working on her book manuscript, which we're all waiting passionately, which continues to explore Ottoman slaves and slaveholders' perceptions of freedom, justice, equality, and in an indirect way, citizenship. I'm also really happy to welcome and introduce Dr. Owen Miller, who will be our discussant today for this BIA lecture on the series of Late Ottoman, Early Republic, and Contemporary Turkey, with a special focus on gender for this year. I forgot to mention that. So, Dr. Owen Miller is an assistant professor of history at Bilkent University in Ankara, as we all know, and really happy to see so many people from Bilkent today at this talk. So, Owen received his doctorate in international and global history from Columbia University in 2015. His work dwells on histories of migration, violence, and conversion, and his manuscript is entitled Religion and Violence at the Ends of the Empire, the Ottoman Conquest of the Mountains. So, the floor is yours, Nidal. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Leonidas, for the introduction, and to Lut for the invitation to begin with. And thank you all for coming. It's such a nice, lovely spring evening, and you are here. But thank you very much for this. It's really a great pleasure. Okay, is it? Okay. It's really a great pleasure to be here to share my research with you. It's a great forum, and also it's such a nice moment to be in Ankara. I should add. What I will be presenting today, it's building. Well, it actually comes from my larger work, as we already mentioned, on slavery and abolition and emancipation in the larger sense of the word in the late Ottoman Empire. And today's paper is building upon a case, a police zaptiye case file, to be specific, and a relatively lengthy interrogation record that's attached to it, istintakname, which I came across at the Başbakanlık. It's not called Başbakanlık anymore, but it's at the Ottoman archives many years ago. Just couldn't really fit in to the dissertation, but it was just too interesting to let go. Initially, I wanted to turn this into an article, and then I decided to tweak the book project and then make this a chapter. So hopefully it will be a chapter eventually in the book that I'm working on. And as a disclaimer, it's a bit all over the place at the moment. It's still in progress, so I hope it will make sense to you, and it will become as I said, coherent chapter, and I really would greatly appreciate your comments and suggestions and criticism precisely for that reason. So the incident recorded in the police file that I just mentioned took place in August 1874, when the customs officers in Constantinople arrested a young black woman who was just disembarking the ship that brought her from Alexandria. And this is the first page of the istintakname, her interrogation, which was carried out, I think, in Arabic and translated. This is the translation. The customs inspection that resulted in the said woman's arrest was part of the heightened international measures against the illegal trade in African slaves in the region, particularly in the Mediterranean, which was contrary to the expectations, still thriving at the time, despite the general ban that went into effect almost 2 decades prior. If anything, the ban actually had an adverse effect on the trade. As Liat Kozma and other historians mentioned and argued, many freeborn and freed persons whose vulnerable positions were often exacerbated by their gender and racial affiliation found themselves coerced back into slavery by voracious slave traders who now allegedly operated in diminished resources following the trade ban in 1857. The young woman's arrest was made on a related assumption that being a young black woman on a ship destined for Constantinople port, as Ehud Toledano, the scholar, historian of Ottoman slavery, described it, the biggest human entrepôt in the Eastern Mediterranean. The assumption was she could not have been anything but a victim of the slave traffickers. So that's really the pretext of the customs officer's arrest of the young woman. And mind you, as a parenthesis, as a side note, this is also the early beginnings of what later becomes white slavery panic that peaks in the early 20th century, a newly emerging set of transnationally deployed enforced political legal measures that had women's mobility and sexuality had their primary concern. This is somewhat concomitant with the tightening anti-immigration policies towards the end of the century, both at the national, colonial, and global contexts. So from the perspective of the customs officers, the young woman also posed a danger vis-a-vis unregistered prostitution. So this was not really the sole concern, but definitely was part of the set of concerns that the customs officers had when they made the arrest. And to give a bit of a broader, larger context of what was going on at the time, heightened international pressure against the slave trade in the region was, in actuality, an extension, an intensification of a series of international legal developments that took place several decades earlier. And by that I mean specifically the Treaty of the Congress of Vienna in 1815. The Congress of Vienna did not only radically redefine the ways in which European states interacted with each other, it also did something quite unprecedented in European or actually world history. It proclaimed the slave trade repugnant to the principles of humanity and universal morality, to use the wording of the relevant article of the treaty, Article 15. And more importantly, for the purposes here, for this paper and also my larger project, is that it has also written, and this is really the unprecedented bit, its gradual abolition into the international law in 1815, extending early, mainly British efforts to abolition of the slave trade to the larger international community. Shortly after, a number of vice admiralty and mixed commission courts Vice Admiralty mixed commission courts were established, ensuing bilateral agreements between signatory states to oversee slave trade tribunals and apply international law. It was really a messy situation, but nevertheless it was enforced, carried out as much as possible. Messy in terms of implementing the law at the global level. As a result, policing the trade in slaves became an internationally pressing legal matter, a root cause of many inter-imperial tensions. These early developments dealt almost exclusively with the illegal trade across the Atlantic and did not initially affect the Ottoman Empire in significant and conspicuous ways. Though this was not really necessarily, because the Ottoman practice of slavery or the volume of trade was smaller in scale. While, I mean, we're still lacking the figures, precise figures or statistical data, but historians of slavery in the Ottoman Middle East estimated that each year about 20,000 people were imported as slaves, and this really amounts to 2 million people across the 19th century. And you can compare it actually to 3.3 million people brought across the Atlantic to the Americas between years 1800 and 1867. It's really not much of a difference in terms of scale. That the Mediterranean trade was left out of the earlier efforts of policing and blockading carried out mainly by the British had more to do with the intricacies of the relations between British and Ottoman empires, particularly in view of the growing Russian power and threat in the region. In that the British officials did in fact monitor the trade in slaves across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea as well from earlier onwards, but intervened only under certain circumstances and quite strategically. For instance, during the years leading up to the Crimean War, as well as during the war itself from 1853 to 56, we see strategic policing and blockading of the Russian ships as a sign of escalating inter-imperial tensions during this time. But still, despite all this, until 1850s, late 1850s, Atlantic trade occupied the top place in Britain's, and by extension, international anti-slavery agenda. This situation changed drastically from the viewpoint of the Ottomans in the second half of the 19th century, particularly after the Ottoman Empire officially became party to the Concert of Europe in 1856, whatever that meant at that specific moment. And the first general ban in slave trade comes literally couple months after the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1856. The ban itself comes in 1857, upon which the Ottoman state joins somewhat less than in a wholehearted manner, needless to say, to the crusade against the slave trade, becomes party to that international legal arrangement. And I'm really interested, this is still, I'm still in the process of exploring this, but I'm really interested in that connection, or that line that connects the Treaty of Congress of Vienna in 1815, Treaty of Paris in 1856, the Reform Edict is the same year as the latter's precondition, predominantly concerned with religious liberties, and the trade ban that comes shortly after that, which are all seem to be embodied in the case that I'm looking at, hence my interest in it in the first place. And as a side note, one of my aims with this chapter, as well as the book project, is actually to take issue with the dominant view that Ottomans were just ready takers of anti-slavery measures as a means of foreign pressure, and that was really not the case. The pressure had different shapes and forms, so that's what I'm trying to explore as well in this chapter. So, I mean, you know, just to go with that, it seems like Ottoman government was really not the passive receiver of the global anti-slavery policies, for a variety of reasons. And in effect, we know that by the turn of the 19th century already, the Ottoman state was partaking in the normal life of the European state system, and accordingly was treated as legitimate the legitimate actor that observed fully the norms of European public law, which is open to debate, of course. But this was increasingly the case. While the Ottoman Empire did not really participate in the Congress of Vienna, it took active interest in it, as the steady flow of reports by Karacayanko evinces, who's really present in Beç at the moment, at the time, and sending reports to Istanbul on regular basis, mentioning anti-slavery policies as well. Couldn't really make sense of it in early cases, but they are really very much involved with the situation, with the legal developments, and also, which I will not really go into in this chapter or in this talk particularly, but one other act of the Treaty of the Congress of Vienna was about the Barbary corsairs, and that really ties to the slavery question as well. So they're very much involved or interested in what's going on at the Congress of Vienna. So this interest became particularly strong or apparent during the heated moments of diplomacy during the 1830s, and followed by the de jure recognition realized by the Treaty of Paris in 1856. So in that, slavery and slave trade, which was one of the really hot-button issues within diplomacy and international law, is a good lens to understand the development of international law from the perspective of the Ottoman Empire. So this is one of the lesser aims of what I try to do in the chapter and in the project. Yet, as with many other things, Ottoman practice of slavery and the trade had its peculiarities, which made the implementation of any abolitionary measure very difficult, to put it lightly. So when the international attention did eventually turn to the Eastern Mediterranean, it became instantly clear that the peculiar and intimate nature of the Ottoman practice of slavery, which comprised almost exclusively women and children destined for domestic, including sexual service, made it very difficult, if at all possible, to even detect the trade, let alone prohibit it. As I've already mentioned, the scale of the trade is not necessarily small, but despite this, the mode of transportation of the Mediterranean trade significantly differed from the Atlantic one, where slave cargo was carried almost always by large, swift vessels built specifically for that purpose. This is a very well-known picture of construction of an Atlantic slaver, really, as opposed to this is supposed to be a slave ship, which is really small, and it was not even used that often. In many cases, the slaves across the Mediterranean specifically were carried on passenger ships. So in the case of the Atlantic trade, there were exceptions to that rule. For one, European settlers returning from Africa with their slaves created instances that made identifying slavery, open to interpretation. Differently from the Atlantic example, in the Mediterranean, slaves were transported in relatively small numbers, as can be seen in this ship. This is a traditional ship that's used to transport slaves from Upper Nile down to the ports, particularly Alexandria, where they're shipped to well, I mean, mostly to Istanbul. There are occasional reports, particularly by the British consular officials, about slaves who were hidden under the decks of the vessels or moved on small slaving ships, bigger than this, but smaller than the Atlantic ones, in the shores that landed in the shores outside of the city ports or disembarked on nearby islands to be secretly taken to the mainland. And I mean, this is just one example of a British consular record that they have been they closely inspect of what's going on, and they write reports on regular basis. And this reports on 4 government-operated ships, passenger ships, that transported slaves. And you can see the name of the ships and the number of slaves that are on it. All in all, within the Mediterranean trade, enslaved women and children, as I said, I mean that they were mostly women and children, not only were transported on passenger ships, but also often simply presented to customs officers or consular inspectors as wives and children of the slave dealers. And this is by far the most commonly reported form of illegal trade in the Ottoman Mediterranean, particularly after the 1857 ban. So it was precisely this intimate nature of the trade, which crossed the frontiers of the private and the public, where the border between freedom and coercion was often unclear, that proved difficult to tackle even for such a powerful champion of abolitionism as Britain, a self-declared champion, but still it really led the crusade against the slave trade in the world at the time. In line with the level of intimacy inherent in the Ottoman practice of slavery and the legal impediments it caused, policing and the suppression of the slave trade was markedly different from the Atlantic practices and necessitated the deployment of certain types of tools and techniques that had the intimate lives of slaves as its primary target. We see, for instance, the customs officers, consular inspectors, frequently questioning the aspects of slaves' familial and intimate relations, such as marriage and motherhood. This is, of course, not to say that these relations were not legally defined and scrutinized. They were and are, but formally speaking, taking an enslaved woman as a wife or a concubine, or a child as evlatlık or ahretlik, adoption, meaning adoption for the purpose of servitude, were not necessarily in conflict with or in violation of the law that defined and regulated these practices and institutions. In other words, none of this seems to constitute a legal problem from the perspective of the Sharia law, but a clear violation from the perspective of the international law. So in that, international law begins to take precedence over local legal practices, which increasingly became so, of course, following the 1856 Reform Edict. In a way, becoming party to the Concert of Europe meant just that, recognizing the precedence of international law over the domestic one. So there's a jurisdictional conflict here between the internationally enforced ban on slave trade and domestically, internally regulated and defined intimate relations that cloaks and facilitates it, which I'm really interested in, and not just for this chapter, but overall for the book project. To give but one example of this intimate scrutiny by the consular officers specifically, and this is really an example that I pulled out of hundreds. I mean, really, so many of them. Robert Cumberbatch, consul in Smyrna, a mad abolitionist who annoyed the hell out of everyone, including the fellow British. And this is there's a gossip bit about him, which I really like to mention in every talk I give. He's the grand uncle of Benedict Cumberbatch of Sherlock Holmes fame. Robert Cumberbatch sent a letter to Henry Elliot, British ambassador in Constantinople in 1869, to report about a case that involved 4 African children and a woman who, under the pretense, in his words, under the pretense of being their mother, had helped their transport from Alexandria to Constantinople. And that was on an Austrian steamer called Apollo as well. That's one detail on the report. The said woman was known to be in connection with a gang of individuals at Alexandria who carried out illegal trade in the region. And what is more, Cumberbatch wrote, it was too plain that the children were not hers, as to judge by their different appearance, they must have come from distinct countries. But he also admitted that there was nothing he could do except for reporting it, and reporting he did, and really every day. In so many other reported instances, adoptive practices that I just mentioned, such as evlatlık and ahretlik and beslemelik, regulated by custom rather than state law, all functioned as a safe haven to those who traded in children and young women illegally. But to go back to the case of the young woman, which I opened my talk with, it was precisely in this context that the Ottoman Customs Police detained her in August 1874. But when they began interrogating her to establish the truth of her victimhood, or perhaps complicity, it's not really that clear, and really, this is the nature of her interrogation, basically questioning all sorts of intimate relations that she had. They found out that, well, maybe she was not a smuggled slave as they thought she was. Here, a minor plot twist occurs when, in the story, when the detained woman told the customs officers that her name was Katerina, and that she was both a member and an employee of a Greek church, a Greek bishop rather, and that she came to Constantinople to take up employment with the said bishop or elsewhere. It's not entirely clear. Ostensibly unmoved by this detail, the customs officers continued with the interrogation with the apparent goal of ascertaining Katerina's free origins, which was really not an easy thing to do. Katerina did not know where she or her parents came from. She herself came to Alexandria when she was very young with her black parents, she specified, who had died there shortly after. She was then taken into the household of a certain Greek man named Georgi, but she was very young then also, so she could not tell whether Georgi purchased her as a slave or not. She had been in Georgi's household working as a servant in the past 9 years. Was she given a salary or an annual sum in exchange for services? The officers asked. Katerina answered in the negative, saying that she did not earn any money, but Georgi had all her clothes made for her. So this is pretty much the standard arrangement for many enslaved servants in the Ottoman Middle East. It doesn't really say anything to the customs officers. So I've just opened a parenthesis here that how come Georgi, as a non-Muslim, can purchase a slave, which was an anomaly in the Egyptian case. Which this is mentioned by historians that, particularly Gabriel Bayer, the early scholar of Middle Eastern Ottoman slavery, argued that not only many native Christians and Jews, but also many foreigners had slaves, especially in Egypt. So this is how Georgi, if he purchased her as a slave, could purchase her. So when Georgi died about a month ago, Katerina contacted a Greek bishop, referred to in the report as the Despot of Istanbul, bishop of the island of Kos, who happened to be in Alexandria at the time and left with him for Constantinople soon after. So the real plot twist of the story came when Katerina told the officers that she did not know whether her parents were Muslim or not. And this is admittedly much less legible for me, so any suggestions, ideas, questions would be greatly appreciated on this. It is precisely this twist which connects the issue of religious rights and liberties to slavery and abolition, which I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the Congress of Vienna, that made me interested in this case in the first place. So that's really the plot twist that I'm interested in. So she was sure, Katerina was sure her parents were black, of course, but she could not remember what religion they practiced. How old was she when they died? The officers asked. She was 9. How could she not remember what religion they practiced at that age? Moreover, and somewhat more relevant to this chapter, were they not the black folk who must be of Muslim origin, or at worst converted to Islam upon their arrival in Alexandria? Just as with her enslaved status, whether imagined or real, Islam was also tightly attached to Katerina's racial affiliation. The Ottoman officials once again readily assumed that she could not have been anything but Muslim, an assumption that was not unrelated to their earlier conviction of her presumed victimhood. Formally speaking, slaves were obtained in raids on pagan peoples in various parts of Africa, and pagan here means a wide variety of religious practices, at times referring to those who were not Muslim enough, depending on the political agenda of the raider. African slaves were obtained, captured in raids on pagan peoples, but for marketing purposes, as John Honwick described it, they were sold into slavery as Muslims. As Honwick further argued, Muslim slave buyers almost certainly would have had grave reservations about purchasing an outright pagan, whose religious status in some sense rendered him or her unclean, especially since they were most likely to be employed in domestic service, living within the owner's house and having access to the intimate life of the family. Again, intimacy comes up in a different context. The conversion presumably took place during the passage, including only the basic tenets of religion, containing in itself a semblance of a civilizing mission by the masters who would clothe, feed, and love them like their brothers and children, as Honwick also mentioned. Conversion aimed, in actuality, to achieve no more than a specification on the bill of sale. So this is not exactly a bill of sale from the port, but this is an example of the bill of sale, which really mentions every detail of the slave. Racial affiliation, obviously, but also physical features and defects in some cases, and rarely for Africans, but sometimes ethnic affiliation as well. Being hard-pressed by the interrogation officers, Katerina admitted that she did remember her parents' names. And this is after long stretches of interrogation. Her parents' names were Yanis and Maria, who were in fact Orthodox Christians and members of the Greek Church. And I mean, of course, the officers asked, why did she retain that information? when the officers asked her in the first place, she replied she was embarrassed and there was no other reason. But there was another reason, a more serious reason to keep that information, as the remainder of the interrogation, subsequent inspection, evinced. When was she baptized, the officers asked. Katerina said that she was 9 years old. If she was baptized at the age of 9, the officers asked, what was she until then? Once again, she said she did not know. From this point on in the interrogation, the problem clearly becomes apostasy, in more general terms, religious rights and liberties, rather than illegal slave trade. Like the abolition of a slave trade, religious liberties too, also a product of the Vienna system, largely speaking, were overseen, if not regulated by international law, agreements that entailed a degree of foreign pressure. And like the abolition of slave trade, the idea of religious freedom was somewhat impaired in jurisdictional conflicts. And I'm using the word impaired in a very, very loose term. Certainly do not mean to imply that there is anything to impair, to begin with. Liberal ideals and fictions, as I like to call them, came to the Ottoman lands already impaired. By signing of the Treaty of Paris, of which the Reform Edict of 1856 was a precondition, the Ottoman government internationally and domestically declared that it would safeguard religious liberties for everyone, while it allegedly continued prosecuting its subjects for apostasy at the same time. In fact, just a year before Katerina's arrest, a Muslim apostate was reportedly publicly executed in Constantinople. The death penalty for apostasy for Islam, that the famous missionary Henry Harris Jessup noted in his correspondences, was never abolished in the Ottoman Empire, as it was fixed by the Quran upon apostates. Jessup might be exaggerating here, but he's also hinting at the fact that while apostasy was not necessarily seen as religious liberty by the Ottoman, or any state really, it could easily be dubbed as such from the viewpoint of the international law, which would bring about foreign pressure. In any event, we know that even if the Ottoman state did not actively go after apostates, the optimistic liberalism of the Ottoman officials quickly faded, as Zeynep Türk-Yılmaz has argued, into increasingly anxiety-ridden, strong-willed, and organized struggle to prevent further apostatizing in the decades that followed the 1856 Reform Edict. So Katerina, who was unable to prove her free or enslaved status and did not even know where she was from, possibly thought that her and her parents' Christian-ness would look suspicious to the Ottoman officials, hence her reluctance in declaring it. In other words, she knew that the personhood not granted to her as a young black woman would emerge at once as an apostate. And I'm really interested in this paradoxical notion of gradated liberties in this particular context, which seems really distinctly Ottoman vis-a-vis the practice of slavery. And this is really the core problem that I'm interested in this chapter specifically. In what ways rights, liberties, obligations are layered and hierarchized throughout the Ottoman reform era, and what are the contact points that those layerings and hierarchizations took place and were shaped. One of these obvious contact points, as we have seen in Katerina's case, was no doubt customs and the policing of movement and border crossings, in this case across the Mediterranean. And hence the title of the talk and also the chapter, Ain't I a Migrant? After Sojourner Truths, a famous utterance, Ain't I a Woman? And also the gradated liberties bit in the title. So to conclude, and I should say I don't really have a proper conclusion just yet, but I would like to end with evoking Eartrode Powell's work on journeys that slaves and free persons have taken. Powell has eloquently argued that when freed African slaves, suspected or real, moved, they carried with them manumission deeds, marriage documents, or specific certificates issued by local, central, or colonial institutions, but never passports or proof of citizenship, as their natio remained always unidentified. In other words, Africans could move under a degree of protection of the Egyptian, Ottoman, British states, Greek or Catholic churches, and of their husbands in the case of women, but never as citizens or subjects. Yet when the suspicion of apostasy stirred within the Ottoman customs officials, Katerina's racial or gender attributes hardly mattered, and she became a citizen and subject at once. In the remainder of the police report, Katerina was interrogated for a few different times, only to reiterate that she did not know her origins or ethnic affiliation, and insisted that her parents were Greek Orthodox. Increasingly more puzzled by her answers and not quite sure what to do with a young woman who was simultaneously black and Greek, the customs police found the solution in summoning a certain Said Efendi to the police station for further inspection. Said Efendi, also of African origin, generically defined as such in the report, was expected to identify the facial markings on Katerina's face, which he had apparently, which he supposedly did. Based on a tattoo on her upper lip, the police report stated, Said Efendi confirmed that Katerina was from Bunu people, who, he added, were indeed Christian. This is really a third minor plot twist here that I will not really go much into, but Bunu is a region in the Yoruba land, which is a fascinating detail because the existing literature on Ottoman slavery largely rules out the Ottoman trade connections with West Africa and maintains that black slaves in the region were brought almost entirely from the eastern coast of Africa and perhaps Central Africa around Lake Chad. While Katerina's case is a singular one, the recognition of Bunu people as such, I really found the detail fascinating, points at the fact that perhaps a more conspicuous connection did exist, which is quite really tenable, especially when the market surplus following the prolonged Yoruba wars, various episodes of trade ban in the Atlantic system, as well as African continent, are taken into consideration. But I mean, I don't really want to tie her or her parents' movement solely to slavery either. There are other reasons to Katerina's parents to end up in Ottoman Egypt, other than those related to slave trade network. We know, again, from Eartrode Powell's work that missionary networks also created means of mobility for Africans, though still they often found themselves in a religious crossfire between state and religious authorities, that their journeys were always forced or carried out in secret. Katerina was eventually confirmed and recorded as Christian and released by the police officers to disappear from the records indefinitely, though one would imagine that this would last only until her next journey.
May I invite Owen?
Thank you so much for coming tonight, and I'd like to again thank Ceyda for what was a brilliant paper, which I'm not at all surprised at, to be honest, having known you for many years, and so that is the part that doesn't surprise me, but many things tonight did surprise me. I should start by perhaps with something that Du Bois once said. When asked what it meant to be black, he said, it means writing Jim Crow. And what I mean by that is to think immediately that questions of race are tied to questions of law, especially particular kinds of laws which are meant to maintain hierarchies. And what I see here, actually, in Ceyda's work is the question of the line. The question of the line between who, not just one line, perhaps many lines, questions of lines between who is free and who is enslaved, who is a Gayru Musliman and who is Musliman, right? The many different lines here are being questioned. And this report, Katerina's report, and the police Zaptia records, show clearly that that the assumptions of society, right? The assumptions of society are being engaged with, right? That we can see in this report the assumptions that the person has, in the same way that perhaps that great uncle of Benedict Cumberbatch, he said, right, as to judge by their distinct appearance, right? So I think we again have to think about the question of race. And I think that in the case of Ottoman history, we have yet really to look at the history of race. Not really. I think that the history of race needs to be examined, and needs to be interrogated, and needs to be examined, and that's what I think Ceyda is working on and following in many ways from the work of your brilliant advisor, Yves Chow-Pao, right, whose work inspired me as well to begin to think about these questions. And you're also approaching the question of Ottoman Africa, right? And another area that I think we have studied far too little, right? We focus perhaps too much on the Balkans, and not enough. I mean, I love Balkans. I think it's great. But I think that we need to spend more time focusing in that direction to the other migratory patterns, and some of them brought as slaves, right? So I think there's a number of different questions about the relationship between gender and race, comparative and connected history. I love the way that you bring the Atlantic into this story, because again, we need to get, when we're thinking about slavery, we need to draw points of comparison, but also points of connection. And I think that the point of connection that was in the back of my head this entire time was thinking about how religion in the study of race in the United States is so central to the history of both slavery and its the abolition, the people who were centrally focused on undoing it, right? Abolishing slavery. When you look at the history of radical abolitionists, you can see that they often placed their points in religious language, and that in some ways the Civil War, the people's scientific racism, was often clothed in religious language as well. So the Civil War was to a certain extent a religious war, right? There's the people who were behind all of it, were at the pulpit on both sides. So the ways in which religion and race come together, the ways in which apostasy and abolition come together, I think are things that I really appreciated about your very close and thoughtful reading of this very complicated document, and returning, in a way, also, most importantly, agency, right? Which is one of the hardest things to get at when you're looking at this, the third point, right? Which is history from below. The people's history of the Ottoman Empire is something that I think we all can work on and write. So with those, I don't have questions except for when is this going to be out. I'm going to leave my questions to the floor, but just with some absolute admiration for the work you've done, and real excitement for seeing where it goes from here. So thank you so much. Oh, right. So that's my job. I'm not used to being in this seat. So please excuse my awkwardness at this stage. But please, are there any questions on the floor? Does anyone have any questions, comments?
How do you assess the current situation, I mean, our times, modern times, with regard to slavery? I mean, you said you referred to the Turkish version of the terminology as destined or what was it? Yes. And still, these words are in our daily language, actually, not maybe Ahmed, but the others. So, and a kind of, in the form of not exactly black people, but the former communist countries or former socialist countries, women are still recruited or employed by Turkish similar form. So how do you assess the current situation, and also in parallel with this question, in Saudi Arabia, for instance, the conditions, working conditions, and the human rights violations of the especially Asian countries, women are worse than maybe the Turkey's case. So how do you assess their situation? I think their working conditions and the violations of their human rights are quite similar to the ones in the Ottoman Empire. And the third question, actually, what do you think about the response of the international law, humanitarian law, and humanistic law to these modern times slavery? I mean, there is ILO, and there are lots of agreements, but do you think that these institutions and their international treaty law are enough to respond to the needs of these people?
Thank you very much. I would add to that what's unleashed by Syrian civil war, that the displaced, particularly women, and very vulnerable. And as early as 2013, really get to see these reports about young women being purchased by Turkish households or Jordanian households, things like that, which really been very much in press in the past years. It's a very complicated situation. Part of it, depends on how you define slavery. Every kind of disparity in power and power relations would, yield a very similar situation, just differing by degree. In that sense, are we going to, call everything slavery in that sense? In my case, I'm taking slavery as defined by law. So in the case of evlatlık, ailelik, and other arrangements, they're not defined as such. They're not legal arrangements necessarily. They're more shaped by custom and just common practice, but not legal arrangements. So in that sense, I'm limiting it to legal definitions, but it doesn't mean that these, particularly the labor situation in Qatar, in Gulf countries, cannot be defined as slavery, modern time slavery. And humanitarian intervention, there's so much work done on this, and it's again a very complicated question to answer. It also has something to do with the agenda of the institution and organization. In the case of the early anti-slavery policies, well, they were brought about by some of them, at least, with genuinely concerned people, but they were often deployed to enact or reenact imperial hierarchies, and just really kind of hijacked by state agendas. And this happens on a daily basis in the case of vulnerable people. So it's a question of how states regulate vulnerability from their perspective. So, yeah, I don't really know if it answers your question, but
I forgot one thing actually. It's another form of maybe slavery, or it's another form of the trade of the women. But before the Syrian crisis, and before also maybe the migration from the neighbor countries of Turkey, from former Soviet countries, especially in southeast of Turkey, especially in Mardin, for instance, I knew that they were bringing women from Morocco to marry as a second wife, and it's still going on. And now Syrian women are more replacing the Moroccan women. So this is also very, I think, in my opinion, unbelievably and unacceptably terrible situation when they are coming from marriage and they are also unpaid labor, lots of violations are together. So.
I see some other questions in the back there, perhaps. Thank you.
Ceyda, thank you very much first of all for this fascinating talk. And I have two questions. One is, did you come across many other documents or cases in the Ottoman archives similar to Katerina's case? Or was it just unique? And it's like another question but relates to that, so I don't count it as my second question. But did you notice any difference in this interrogation during different times? But I mean, this is from 1874. What about a case, another interrogation, but during Abdülhamid's time? Did you notice any difference? And my second question is, I know it's quite unlikely, but in terms of agency, do we have any writings by any slave woman? You know, I'm sure they were not very literate, but is it possible to hear their voice? Did you come across any writings by them? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. No, I haven't come across anything close to Katerina's, particularly from the religious dimension. There are interrogation records in so many other cases, particularly if there's a crime, enslaved women, mostly African origin, they end up in the court for, it's kind of like known crimes of arson, theft. I would say they're less likely to form networks, like support networks, than Circassian slaves, for instance. So they kind of like navigate their situation on their own, and they're more likely to be caught in some like criminal act and end up the court. That's what I at least observed. So Katerina's case is unique precisely because of her. We don't really know if she's enslaved or not. They don't know, and we don't really know if she was Muslim and nothing about her case is clear, but the way that it was questioned, interrogated, and that she dodges the interrogation in her, I was just really fascinated that her courage to take the journey to begin with. By herself. There's no mention of the bishop. I don't think he was on the ship. I don't really know what happened to him, but she seems to be alone. And that's kind of a statement to begin with, to take the journey all by herself. So that was one thing that really I found fascinating. But hers is unique. In that sense, it's not exemplary, but the way that makes me question things, and interrogators questioning things is what makes it valuable. So, as for slave women writing, when the enslaved members of the imperial harem, they did write. If we count them as slaves, that's another question. Elite households, they did write, but not in the case of people like Katerina or those who were not concubines necessarily or handmaidens and so, but they were there for the actual domestic work. They did not write. But they gave really lengthy the answers to interrogators, which are also, of course, mediated. But that's how we get to, what they think, how they live their ordinary lives. There might be, but these things are kind of like kept within the family and private archives. If they exist, I don't really know about them. But yeah, that's.
Yes.
Ceyda, let me join the rest to thank you so much for this fascinating talk, and both of you for such a vibrant event. And actually, what Owen said, there are so many different lines of thinking that one can look at the case, and one of it is actually the relation of religion and authority. And what I was wondering is whether there is any effort by the investigators to check the story from the perspective of the religious Orthodox religious authorities. And is there something like this? And if not, I think it's quite interesting there, because there's a solid story presented which potentially could be checked.
Yeah. They could just check with the church. I don't think they did it. What I think in this case, only because Said Effendi confirmed that she was Christian, but I think they could do it. They could just send someone to Alexandria to get the exact records of the time of her, the time, date that she was baptized, and her family records, etc. I would think that they would go that way if she's not confirmed. They could have just let her go. It's in the end, it's difficult to establish, but they don't really do it. They prefer to actually bring in this other African, who's really generically defined and kind of like recognized, inspector facial markings. But that's possible. That's that's really what I have been thinking about. But why wouldn't they do that? They don't really mention it as a possibility.
Thank you for this lovely presentation. It's really instructive and thought-provoking. I was wondering if you are planning on placing this abolishment of slavery in Ottoman case within a larger framework of the Eastern question, because you started with the Vienna Congress and you continued with the Paris Treaty of 1856, and you also talked about the Ottomans' admission into the Council of Europe. So perhaps when you do that, you can discuss about the agency of the Ottoman Empire within this whole process, because when it comes to the Eastern question, it's always a big debate whether the Ottomans had an agency or they just went through the flow and they had to obey the expectation or whatever imposed upon them. So it's just this slavery thing, it seems to me, is a very fruitful.
I'm still in the process of exploring really particularly the first half of the 19th century, because there is quite a bit entanglement between the British, the Russian, and the Ottoman empires, and slavery becomes a question, and then it changes its significance as the Eastern question changes its significance and meaning and shape later on in the 19th century. So yes, definitely, I am interested in how Ottomans. One of the things that I really try to do is to show that the Ottomans were not really ready takers of those policies. They actually negotiated. The one report that I read from Karacayanko, he really didn't quite make sense of the anti-slavery issues at the time, but it was a really short report. So that's something that I'm exploring still. but they do, I mean, the fact that the general ban, the first general ban in the Ottoman Empire comes really like a couple months after the Treaty of Paris, says something which, you know, like kind of the ending of the actual ending of slavery in Turkey comes in 1933, after Turkey becomes a member of the League of Nations, and you know, like that they become signatory to the 1926 Anti-Slavery Convention. So there's a line of obviously that, I mean, just, I don't really want to stretch it too hard, but yes, there is a relation with inter-imperial tensions, relations, and the slavery question.
Yes, over there.
Not a question anymore because Leonidas somewhat asked my question, but maybe a comment. There were maybe some other ways of confirming that she belonged to the Greek Orthodox Church. All the other patriarchates, other than the Patriarchate of Constantinople, had representatives in Istanbul, and all of them had Arab Orthodox members in their churches. And the Patriarch of Jerusalem himself was actually most of the time residing in Istanbul. So possibly
that's great.
there were other options to confirm.
Yeah, I mean, there's no mention of like needing to do that, but it gives me an idea of like maybe they did this for other cases, which I don't really know how often people, you know, arrive at the Istanbul port, being, you know, Greek and African and all those complicated cases, but it's actually great to know that they could follow that route in a similar case.
Other questions? I might use this as an opportunity to ask a question that I was thinking of. I had a lot of questions in my mind, but I couldn't think of any of them when I was up there. One of the questions I was wondering about actually has to do with this taking place in 1874. 2 years later, famously, Leopold II brings together a bunch of explorers from around the world, but specifically also of Africa, and begins to set up his secret mission to create his own colony, right? This is a very famous moment. And of course, it's predicated especially in his own address on bringing, pinning together, bringing the light of Europe and civilization with anti-slavery, right? So it's the underlying pretext is of this, what it ends up being a history of colonialism in Africa, right? With 10 years later, the Berlin Conference, is predicated actually on an anti-slavery rhetoric. Yeah. So I was thinking about this question about the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman ideas of civilizing missions, and whether that plays a role in this, especially because if we look at a map of the Ottoman Empire, usually it represents, we see some parts of it well represented, and other parts like the fact that, you know, there's this guy named Emin Pasha who's in what is today Uganda by the 1880s with an Ottoman flag, right? So Ottoman Uganda has been kind of written out of the story completely, but we could bring it back into the story when we're talking about histories of slavery and histories of colonialism, right? And I was just curious what you think about that relationship.
No, it's a fascinating question that I don't really know much about, I should say. But there is an inherent contradiction in all this. I mean, even the beginning point, what I took as the beginning point, the Congress of Vienna, comes as kind of like a reaction to like, you know, the revolutionary situation, and takes anti-slavery rhetoric as its like one of its main missions in a sense. So also, I mean, this kind of like unravels later in the 19th century as well. So it doesn't really strike me that this was also put into use in colonizing Africa. So it's a fascinating connection. I should look into that definitely, but I don't really have much to say about it. It's really fascinating.
Well, any final questions, comments?
If no, we can actually continue over wine.
Yeah, great.
So a big thank you to our speaker and to our discussant for this And as always, I thank you to the BIAA team for organizing this.
Yes, yes, indeed. Thank you.